Hey guys, welcome back to my sewing room. I'm Kelly and you found me here on Pickin' Stitches, and today I'm going to talk all about starch. I've been getting a lot of questions about how I starch, when I starch, and it's certainly not the end all be all, but I would like to walk you through what I like to do. Okay, so let's start out by saying that starch is a very personal preference. Some people use absolutely no starch ever, and other people have their stuff so starched that it practically will stand up by itself. I'm somewhere in the middle. I historically liked to starch with a product called Sta-flow, and you guys are probably familiar with it. It came in a liquid container and I loved it. I would dilute it about 50-50, maybe 60% water, 40% this liquid. Somewhere in there usually gave me about the right result that I wanted. If I was doing a project that was going to have a lot of bias cutting, I probably used a little bit heavier starch. And if I was doing something that was mostly squares, like this quilt over here behind me, you don't have to use as much starch because it's not going to stretch because you're not working on that bias. So unfortunately, this company stopped making this product. So I've kind of been experimenting with some other homemade versions, but I wanted to show you just some of the other stuff that I have in my craft room. A lot of times if I'm getting ready to do a project, I'm going to take all of that fabric and I'm going to starch it all together. But you know how it is, you get into a project and then you need a little bit more of something and you go find it in your stash and you need to just make it work. That's where I might use this can of Faultless or my Best Press, depending on what level I want to use it in. And if you see it in my videos, I keep it in this continuous spray bottle. This is Mary Ellen's Best Press right now. I actually have another product that came in from Fat Quarter Shop's Sew Sampler a couple months ago called Flatter that I want to try, but I was waiting for this one to run out first. So I really don't use this very often. It's typically when I have a whoopsie and I need to add more fabric to a project that I'm working on and I just didn't get it starched with the batch. Most of the time I'm going to do this liquid starch option. And when they stopped producing this, I started making my homemade one. And I have another video from a couple of months ago where I make starch with cornstarch on the stovetop, and I do a ratio that has worked out well for me. I find that a little bit times if you boil it for a little bit too long, you might make it a little thicker. You need to add a little bit more water because you've had some evaporate off. The problem with that is if you didn't use it in a day or two, it smelled funny, like really funny, like goat cheese funny, and I would throw it out and have to start over. So I started looking around the internet and I found some recipes for something called Quilter's Moonshine, which just sounds funny. Now that I'm in Tennessee from Texas, it's fitting. I love it. It's cute. So Quilter's Moonshine is basically adding vodka to your starch mix. So I'm going to walk you through exactly how I'm making my starch these days, and then how I like to starch my fabrics, how I like to dry them, how saturated they are, all those things. So stick around and I will take you over to the kitchen and I'll show you all those steps. Okay guys, so this is the same starch recipe that I had in my previous video, with one exception. I am adding a little bit of vodka to it. If you look up Quilter's Moonshine, there is a lot of different blog posts and stuff about it. But I do like to do my 1 tablespoon of starch to 2 tablespoons of, I like to do my 1 tablespoon of starch to 2 cups of water. I still think that 1-to-1 ratio is just too much. So I'm going to do 4 cups of water and 4 tablespoons of starch, and I'm not super precise about it. I'm going to mix this in and heat it up, and then I'm going to add my last 4 cups of liquid. And if I know I'm going to use it right away, then I'll just make it all with water. Oh, my batteries are out. There we go. And then I'm just going to stir it up, make sure it's well incorporated. If you start with really hot water, this is going to get really lumpy. And you can still fix it, but it's just easier for me if I don't start with really lumpy. So after I've got it well incorporated, I'm just going to turn it on low, and I'm going to heat it up probably like a medium temperature until it's just barely starting to simmer. And this is a rather small batch for me. Honestly, I've been making it probably 2 to 3 quarts, maybe even a gallon at a time. But I like this little immersion blender for that, or I guess this is a coffee stirrer. I like the big immersion blender if I'm going to be doing a bigger batch. And you can always, if it gets a little bit lumpy on you for some reason, maybe your water was too hot or maybe you didn't incorporate it well in the beginning, throw it in the blender, really puree it, and it will be just fine. So we're going to let that start to heat up, and I'll meet you back here when it's starting to simmer a little bit. Okay, so I bumped this up to a 5. It is barely starting to rumble here. I definitely don't want to let it go too far. So I'm going to keep giving it a little stir because sometimes that starch does settle on the bottom while you're waiting for it to heat up. And it's going to turn a little bit more translucent as it finishes up processing. Okay, so now we're at like a little quick rolling boil here. I don't want to let it to go too long. I'm just going to give it a good stir, and then I'm going to let it cool off. And again, sometimes it may get a little clunky on you, maybe a little bit chunky. That's fine. You can always throw it in the blender. So I've got half of the amount of liquid in here now that I want. I'm going to add at least 4 more cups of liquid. If I'm going to use the starch in the next day or 2, I'm probably just going to add water. But if it's going to be more than a day or 2, it kind of starts to smell funky, and I don't want to have to keep up with the date line on it. So I end up adding about 1 cup of vodka for 3 to 4 quarts of water, somewhere kind of in that realm. But the ratio is still pretty much the same. I'm still going 2 cups of liquid to 1 tablespoon of starch. So that's what I found works for me lately. I'm going to let this cool all the way down, add the rest of my water to it, and then I will just add it to my typical jugs that I keep it in. Again, if it's going to be more than a couple of days, then I will have a piece of that water be, or a piece of that liquid be the vodka. If you guys have another recipe that you want me to check out, I would love to hear it. This is, again, just me trying to figure out something we can use in lieu of the Sta-flow, which is what I used for everything before they stopped making it.
My pretty standard. Okay, so this is my pretty standard setup for starching. I just have this fabric rack for drying, and it just folds out. I think I got it on Amazon or Walmart. It's just got a lot of different slots on it. I like to hang my fabric over 2 slots if I can because it dries faster, but if I have a lot, it's not a problem to have them touching. And then I have a vinyl tablecloth underneath the whole setup. And I just use some old towels to kind of absorb anything that wants to drip off. Because I do end up having a lot of starch. And then this is just a container. Again, I think I probably got this at Walmart. It's supposed to be one of those that you can set on your countertop to wash dishes in. I just pour my starch in here, saturate my fabrics, and then when I'm done, if it still looks pretty clean, like if it's a lot of pinking edges and there's a lot of little fibers, I won't pour it back in the container. Or if it's had some color bleed through, then I won't pour it back. But otherwise, I just put it right back in my starch container and use it on the next batch.
Okay guys, I moved over to the floor. Hopefully this will give us a little bit better vantage point, but I just take all of my light fabrics at the same time, and I'm just going to give them a really good soaking. I'm going to turn that over and then kind of open it and close it until it's all saturated. Please turn that volume off, boys. And if you wring your fabric out like a washcloth, then it puts a lot of wrinkles in it. So I'm going to be very careful with it to treat it delicately, but you can see all of that is not saturated quickly. So I would either let it soak for a little bit and then come back to it, or I just keep changing what direction is exposed to the outside. And that looks totally saturated from the back. So it depends on how much time I have, but I also will take it and just kind of drape it over my rack and let it drip into this drawer. So I'll pull back so you guys can see that. Okay, so totally saturated. It's really drippy right now. And then I would take this and then maybe double it over and just let it drip into this pan for a bit. If I'm really pressed for time and I want to get it up and drying faster, and I don't have time to do that with 3 or 4 different batches, I might lightly run my hands down it to wring some of the water out. But again, if you twist it like a washcloth, I feel like it distorts the fabric and you have a whole lot more ironing and steam ironing to do to get it flat again. And I feel like it still isn't ever going to be quite as flat as it would be if you just let it do this for a minute. So I would let this go for a minute and grab my next darker color and let it sit in the bottom and soak while this is dripping. Now for this bundle, the next color they have is getting us into reds and pinks. And I almost always save these for the very last. Even though these are Moda and Moda isn't typically very bad about it, I've just had so much experience with red stuff that continues to fade. And I don't want fading to happen. And when it fades and it leaves the dye in my starch, the next batch of color that I put in there is going to pick up those same red hues, which is why I always start with the white ones first. And then I'll just do these the exact same way, kind of flip them around, make sure they're nice and saturated all the way through. And if you find that your starch is too stiff, you can always wet them down with a little bit of water and rehang them. That works sometimes. Or if it's too light, you can always use another drying round with a new section of starch on top. But you see how that's not gotten any of the starch because it just hasn't been in here long enough. So if you have all the time in the world and you can just walk away and let it soak, that's certainly the easiest. That's generally not me. So then I would take these and separate them into individuals and just hang them out on the rest of the rack. And then I would just hang it up and kind of let it drip for a minute. Oops. And you really don't have to do it into a container. I mean, this is an inexpensive enough option, but I don't like to have to remake starch all the time, so. So once they've dripped out and I'm ready to hang them up, I just hang them up one at a time across the rack. If I have enough spots, I like to hang them up over 2 because they dry faster. But if I don't have enough spots, one at a time is just fine. And if I'm really in a hurry, I'll put the ceiling fan on, or, you know, in the winter, a space heater. I won't do it during the summer, but usually they dry pretty fast, especially if you'll come in here and just rotate them in like half an hour to the other side of the fabric and you have a light fan blowing on them. They don't take long at all.
Okay, so this is pretty much my standard setup, and I just leave it here until it dries.
Okay, guys, so that's how I like to make my starch. I do have some of my old Sta-flow bottles, and I liked to use those in the beginning, but I found I couldn't tell if the starch had settled and gotten kind of chunky. So we use a lot of vinegar as a natural weed deterrent in our yard, and I have a lot of these kind of semi-translucent bottles from my vinegar jars. So I've just washed it out, and now it's got my starch in it, and I can kind of see if it's gotten chunky. If you've let it sit for a little while and it hasn't been touched, you can try shaking it, but I find sometimes it doesn't mix back totally. So that's when I'll throw it back in the blender, which is another step. Unfortunately, that's the only way that I've found to really get it incorporated so that you don't get thick chunks left on your fabric. And you certainly don't want that. It feels like if you have it and it's a little bit too if you haven't mixed it back together and you use it anyways, you'll pull your fabric out, you'll start to iron it, and it almost feels like little sections of it have Elmer's glue, if you're familiar with that. Maybe it's me and the kids, but it feels like it has a little Elmer's glue section stuck on it. So once you use the quilt and wash it, it'll go away, but I don't like to sew with it like that. So I would throw it back in the blender if you find that it's at all chunky or not mixed together well. And after a couple minutes in the blender, you can go ahead and use it. And I find that with that little bit of vodka added to it to add just a little bit of preservative, I've had a whole lot longer shelf life. I use a lot of starch, so I can't say, if it's months and months, but when I've used it a week or two or three later, it hasn't had any of those same problems that without the vodka it was having. So I hope this helps. If you guys enjoy watching all of my crazy tutorials about moonshine quilting or any of the other things that I throw up on the channel, hit that like and subscribe button. It helps me out a ton. And until then, I will see you guys next time.